Mighty Max was one of the most original franchises for kids in the 90s. Yes, admittedly, it was just one more example of a snarky blonde kid with a wiser, older mentor protecting the multiverse from an undead warlord, usually with some kind of skull theme or dark elf Count Orlok aesthetic. But what really set Max apart from his contemporaries was the way his co-creative adventures defied genre. The toy line, comics, and animated series remained rooted in horror, but always found a way to branch out into science fiction, adventure, and fantasy, somehow managing to pay tribute to its influences without coming across as yet another knockoff brand. Here's the full story of Mighty Max, how it's influenced me, and why I'm glad there hasn't been a reboot or sequel series. Mighty Max, Mighty Max. Do I need to remind anyone about Mighty Max's humble beginnings as a Polly Pocket for Boys toy line? Yeah, probably. Okay, well, I'll be brief since about 80% of you have heard this already. It was 1992 and Bluebird Toys, a company based in the UK, began distributing a series of microcosmic portable toy sets based on the super gendered Polly Pocket toy line, also by Bluebird, which started back in 1989. In the United States, these toys were distributed by Mattel. I can't tell you what these playsets meant to me. Or rather, I could, but we would be here all day. What I can tell you is what I appreciated. On a purely universal level, I loved how available Max and his many enemies were to me. If you had a Doom Zone, one of the earliest Mighty Max lines, you knew what it was like to resume an adventure you started in your bedroom in the back seat of the family van. When I was a kid, I frequently played make-believe outside in the yard, or else on the neighborhood sidewalks where my action figures weren't allowed to be for nebulous reasons. I had a whole imagined TV channel in my brain with after-school blocks of original programming I would play along to. Occasionally, some kid I barely knew would drive by, his mom in the driver's seat. They'd pull over when they'd see me walking on the sidewalk mumbling to myself. "Are you okay?" the kid's mom would ask. "Oh, I'm fine, Karen. I'm just playing Star TV." Mighty Max, by virtue of his portability, helped me look a little less crazy. On a deeper level, and this is where I may lose some of you, I am an occultist who happens to subscribe to the theory that stories have consciousness, and the ones we resonate with form the basis of our personal mythologies. Now, for some of us, our religious upbringings form the basis of our personal mythologies, but I did not have a particularly religious family until about 4 or 5 years after Mighty Max went out of vogue. So, like a lot of 90s kids who weren't subjected to religious tyranny until the Bush administration hijacked our parents, my mythology was populated by Power Rangers and Nintendo characters and all the wonderful archetypes woven through the Mighty Max franchise. Between the toy line and animated series, you had the bases covered, the Chosen One, the aforementioned wise old mentor, the Dark Lord, the Guardian, plus all the universal monsters and sci-fi inspired mutants who factored a little more heavily into the original toy line than the series. Speaking of the animated series, wow, what a breath of fresh air that was. Remember that relative or hopefully trustworthy family friend who always made a point of talking to you when you were a kid without using the same condescending tone most adults used when speaking to small children? That's kind of how the animated series was written. I mean, it wasn't high art. Max could be particularly obnoxious sometimes. He was like Sophia from the Golden Girls, but dumbed down and trapped in the body of a teenage boy. But I guess what I'm saying is that the animated series cast a wide net emotionally, and the writers frequently explored themes most of us wouldn't find in animation until we saw our first subtitled anime. Themes of death and loss, sacrifice, and abject failure. Take the episode where Max's protector, Norman, is hunted by the monster who killed his father, in which we're treated to a flashback where said father dies.
"I killed your weakling father, and now I'll kill you too."
I lost count of the number of times the show used the words killed, killing, and died, dying. This was back when Power Rangers was still saying destroyed. The violence itself was never gratuitous, at least not in the show. We'll talk about the toy line later, but the dialogue at 34 gave me pause.
I'll rip your limbs from your body and slowly suck the marrow from your bones.
Not that I think that's a bad thing. Fear, especially in genre shows, can be instructive. And how many kids could truly be afraid of a costume monster who threatens to destroy their favorite superheroes? Skullmaster was genuinely frightening, and the fact that he ultimately kills Max's partners left quite an impression on me, and I'd wager on you. Sometimes the bad guys win, even in waking life. Mighty Max prepared us for that reality. Not that it was doom and gloom through and through. Most of the harder-hitting episodes ended on a hopeful note.
Who dares?
Run, hero! Get out while you can! You can't beat Skullmaster, he'll kill you! Yeah, well, maybe I'll come back as a butterfly.
But it was hope of a cyclical nature. In the series, death yields rebirth, and failure sometimes leads to second chances. Still, I wonder if Mighty Max as a franchise flew a little too close to the sun. It was certainly ahead of its time. The animated series didn't hold with social norms like kids respecting authority. They had educational bumpers at the end of every episode, but they weren't preachy and they never came across as PSAs. And that's saying nothing about the violence, dialogue, and occult horror elements. The animated series was a toy commercial at its core, meant to drum up interest in the toy line. But interest can be a double-sided sword. Kids were watching and taking a closer look at the toys, but so were parents. My partner tells a story about getting a Mighty Max set for Christmas, likely Skull Dungeon from a family member. The next day it was gone, completely and utterly, thrown out by a parent most likely. I wonder how many Mighty Max fans have a story like this. Mighty Max took off in 1992, just as the Satanic Panic was starting to take hold in the United States, again. The West Memphis Three, a trio of American teenagers accused of satanic ritual abuse and murder, were arrested in Arkansas in 1993. And parents started flipping out about books like Goosebumps around the same time. Some of the artwork on the Mighty Max mini-comics could be especially intense by today's standards. Like this one from Mighty Max Defeats Vamp Fighter, which would have been on the back of the box the playset came in. Blood-spattered props, skeletons, and paraphernalia some triggered parents could have viewed as occult in theme were commonplace. I can see how some of these parents barely noticed or cared when buying the initial playsets, only to take a deeper look when Tim Curry as Skullmaster was on TV.
I will teach you 1,000 subtle shades of pain, 100 ways to die, until I finally lay your lifeless body at my master's table.
And I'm sure that was part of the equation. There were other factors, so it's hard to identify the killing blow. Another angle to consider was the decline of the micro-toy craze. It was oversaturated and it ran its course. The Mighty Max generation was also the Game Boy generation, and a lot of us lost interest in toys right about the same time as the Satanic Panic decided to let up again. New waves of the toy line were planned, but who was there to take our place? The new millennium was coming, and a cyberpunk redesign of Max, along with gun-toting Skullmaster and Norman, couldn't make the franchise any younger.
Here goes nothing! Not so fast, bonehead!
You fool! You can't save the world!
I can die trying!
You will!
When the animated series ended, Max was taken back in time through a loop to the first episode, except with all of his memories intact. It really reminds me of the ending of Stephen King's Dark Tower cycle, where the hero Roland enters the room at the top of the tower and is taken back in time to the beginning of the first novel. Roland's made some terrible choices throughout the course of the 7 books, like the sacrifice of his spiritual son, Jake, which is why he has to repeat the cycle. Furthermore, he learns he's completed this cycle many times, but this time he's attained some real growth, which bodes well for the eventual outcome of the latest loop he's in. Mighty Max predates this latest installment in the Dark Tower series by about a decade. And while I don't think Stephen King drew inspiration from Mighty Max, I think the two stories are linked. Aesthetically, they're not all that different. They're both genre-hopping sci-fantasies about a flawed hero traversing horror-themed dimensions. Again, stories have consciousness if you go in for that sort of thing. So, in that sense, Mighty Max is sort of like a gospel to me. Bluebird and Mattel could have easily retooled He-Man again, or licensed someone like Johnny Quest to star in their micro-toy adventures. Or they could have taken the path of least resistance and built a franchise around the public domain versions of the Universal monsters. But they didn't. All of those pieces were there, but they were pieces of a whole, and the finished product was something new. I don't know what the creative process for the toys was like, but in 2011, Mark Zaslove, who developed the animated series, was interviewed for the webzine CLCI. When asked where he derived his ideas, he said,
"Mighty Max was my Johnny Quest, but updated. I wanted a fearless kid who didn't have superpowers and wasn't afraid of being smart when necessary, which meant, when confronted with superior force, he'd run away. I also, after seeing some of the toys, wanted to do a retelling of basic mythologies, a new way to do werewolves, cyclops, etc.
And I think that's really commendable, speaking from 2021, where we are surrounded by branded characters who have been around, in some cases, for nearly a century, which is precisely why I am glad Mighty Max never got a reboot or a revival as a toy line or an animated series. In this way, he continues to serve as a testament to originality, one we can learn from as creators. At the time of my writing this, Paramount Plus has announced revivals of Rugrats, The Fairly Odd Parents, SpongeBob SquarePants, Frasier, and Beavis and Butthead. Starz is even bringing back Weeds, which ended as recently as 2012. And while I'm a fan of some of these series, a big part of me wishes their showrunners would just sit down and watch Mighty Max. Reboot culture isn't slowing down, but I think we might be entering the late stages of this particular wave, or at least a lull. And writing this, I'm starting to wonder if maybe the only way out is through. Maybe reboot culture is the price we'll pay for another creativity renaissance. In the meantime, we can all take a page from Mighty Max. Thanks for watching. Be sure to check out my other videos on modern mythologies which have influenced me as a storyteller. You can also check me out on Instagram at FayPageAuthor. If you like what you see and want to help support my platforms and get free content besides, like early access to my videos and free tarot readings, you can check out patreon.com/FayPage.
We should all remember that. See you next week.